The Washington family arrived in their new neighborhood on a bright summer day, brimming with optimism. David, tall and calm, helped guide the movers, while Lena managed their children, Marcus and Ava. The air was filled with a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment from the neighbors, watching through curtains and behind half-closed blinds. No one spoke, but the silence carried unspoken discomfort. David focused on the task at hand, staying cheerful. He smiled at Marcus, trying to mask his own awareness of the eyes on them. "Why don't you help your sister unpack her things?" he said, keeping his tone light. Lena, ever composed, brushed off the tension with grace, assuring Ava that their new home would soon feel like theirs. The neighborhood, mostly white, had seen few changes over the years. The Washingtons were new, different, and that difference stirred an unease that rippled beneath the surface. Martha Evans, sitting on her porch with her tea, glanced at the new arrivals with a hint of suspicion. In her 60s, Martha had lived in this neighborhood for decades, watching it change far slower than the world outside it. To her, the Washingtons represented something she couldn't quite place, but it unsettled her all the same. She sipped her tea, her gaze unwavering, while her mind churned over what their arrival meant. David, though aware of the looks, kept his focus on his family's well-being. He had dealt with worse. As the newly appointed police chief, his job came with challenges, ones that tested him not only as a leader but as a black man in a predominantly white town. He knew the balancing act all too well, how each move would be scrutinized, how people would judge him before knowing him. Lena, his rock, understood this too, and they had long agreed to approach their new life with a sense of dignity and openness. Later that evening, over dinner, they discussed their first impressions of the neighborhood. "It's nice," Lena offered, though her eyes betrayed a hint of concern. David nodded. "We'll get to know them. It'll take time, but we'll show them who we are." They both knew the unspoken challenge that lay ahead. This wasn't just about settling into a new house. This was about making their presence known, in a way that felt safe, respectful, and firm. Martha, meanwhile, couldn't shake her wariness. She wasn't overtly hateful, but her prejudices ran deep, ingrained by a lifetime spent in a world that rarely challenged her views. As she watched the Washingtons unpack, she felt that familiar twinge of resistance, the kind that told her to keep her distance. "Why can't things stay the way they are?" she muttered to herself. She missed the quiet, the familiarity, the predictability. Change, especially in this form, didn't sit well with her. The following week, David and Lena decided to host a barbecue, hoping to extend a hand of friendship. They knew they need to make the first move if they wanted to be a part of the community. The kids were excited, especially Ava, who had already started planning decorations. Marcus was less enthusiastic but supportive. Lena made invitations, simple and polite, and together they went door to door, offering a warm smile and a friendly introduction to their new neighbors. When they reached Martha's house, David knocked softly, expecting little more than a polite exchange. Martha opened the door, her face unreadable. "We're hosting a barbecue this Saturday, just something small to get to know everyone," Lena said, her smile warm but not overbearing. Martha hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Thank you, but I think I'll pass," she replied, her voice tight. She didn't offer a reason, and none was needed. As the Washingtons prepared for their barbecue, Martha watched from her porch again, her discomfort growing. She didn't voice her thoughts, but they lingered in her mind. To her, the Washingtons' attempt to integrate felt like an intrusion. They didn't belong, not really. She remained isolated in her own thoughts, letting them fester as the neighborhood buzzed with quiet curiosity about the Washingtons' gathering. At the barbecue, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming, at least on the surface. A few neighbors had shown up, cautiously engaging with David and Lena. The kids played in the yard, and laughter filled the air. Yet Martha stayed on her porch, a silent observer. Her absence didn't go unnoticed, but no one commented on it. David, though disappointed, kept his focus on those who did come, making an effort to connect, knowing it would take more than one event to build real bridges. As the night wound down, David and Lena cleaned up, quietly reflecting on the day. It hadn't gone perfectly, but it had been a start. They knew there would be hurdles, but they were ready. They weren't looking for acceptance overnight. They were looking for the slow, steady progress of understanding. Martha, on the other hand, sat alone, her heart heavy with her own conflict. She couldn't deny the warmth she saw in the Washingtons, but her resistance to change ran deeper than logic. And so, the tension between the old and the new, the familiar and the unknown, quietly simmered, waiting for the moment it would boil over. The Washingtons had worked hard to prepare for their barbecue, determined to make it a day of joy and connection. Their friends, both black and white, arrived throughout the afternoon, bringing food, laughter, and warmth. Marcus and Ava played with other kids in the yard while David and Lena made sure everyone felt welcome. Music flowed through the air, mixing with the smell of grilling food. It was a perfect summer day, filled with the sound of conversations and bursts of laughter. From the outside, it was simply a gathering of friends and family. But Martha, watching from her window, didn't see it that way. As the hours passed, her annoyance grew. The music was too loud, the laughter too boisterous, the sight of the Washingtons hosting such a lively event grated on her nerves. She couldn't understand why this family thought they could bring such noise and disruption to what had always been a quiet, orderly neighborhood. Martha had grown accustomed to a certain kind of peace, one that wasn't filled with the unfamiliar sounds she was now hearing. From her perch, she noticed some of the other neighbors. A few of them were smiling, watching the scene with casual approval. Others, like her, wore frowns, clearly uncomfortable. Martha's discomfort deepened as she saw more and more of the guests, many of them black, arriving, laughing, and mingling in her once predictable street. To her, it felt like everything was slipping away, her control over the environment, her comfort in the way things had always been. Inside her mind, Martha's frustration turned darker. It wasn't just the noise or the crowd that bothered her. It was the fact that the Washingtons were at the center of it. Her thoughts drifted back to a time when things were different. A time when the people in her neighborhood looked like her, acted like her, and didn't bring this kind of change. Her memories, tinged with nostalgia, only amplified her current unease. She believed there was something improper about this whole event, something that wasn't just about the noise. It was about the way this family was changing the very fabric of her world. As she stewed in her thoughts, Martha became more convinced that something was wrong. To her, it wasn't just a gathering, it was an invasion of sorts, an unsettling display of disregard for the norms she held dear. And that's when she snapped. She couldn't take it any longer. She picked up the phone, her hands trembling slightly as she dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Martha's voice came out sharper than she intended. She spoke in a way that hinted at the core of her discomfort without saying it outright. "There's a large group of them," she said, the words weighted with meaning. She emphasized the size of the crowd, how out of control the situation seemed to her. She made sure to stress that something wasn't right, that this gathering felt wrong in her neighborhood. The operator, following protocol, assured her that officers would be sent to check on the situation. Martha hung up, feeling a strange mix of relief and righteousness. She had done what she believed was necessary to restore the peace she felt had been shattered. Minutes ticked by as Martha watched the scene outside. Her eyes narrowed, focusing on every laugh, every movement, every smile. She convinced herself she was right to call, that the police would see what she saw, that they would bring order back to her world. Her heart raced as she waited for the officers to arrive, a tense excitement building within her. When Officers Perez and Thompson pulled up, they were surprised by the nature of the call. It had sounded urgent on the radio, like a potential disturbance, but as they arrived, they saw nothing more than a friendly neighborhood barbecue. Still, they had a job to do, and they couldn't just drive away without at least checking in. As they approached, their attention was immediately drawn to the man standing near the grill, David Washington, their police chief. Perez and Thompson exchanged glances, unsure of how to proceed. They had just started on the force, and now they were about to interrupt their boss's family event. David noticed them right away, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He walked over calmly, not wanting to cause a scene. "Officers," he greeted them, his voice steady but carrying a hint of tension. Perez and Thompson were caught off guard. They had expected something much different from the call, and now they were face to face with their superior in an awkward situation. They stammered through an explanation, unsure of how to address the issue. David, sensing their discomfort, didn't immediately bring Martha into the conversation. He knew what had happened, though. He could feel the weight of her eyes on him from across the street. The officers, unsure of how to handle the situation, stood there awkwardly, trying to figure out their next move. David, always measured, kept things calm. He could see that they were uncomfortable, but he didn't let that tension affect the atmosphere of the barbecue. He thanked them for checking in, making it clear that there was no disturbance and that the gathering was peaceful. The officers, grateful for his understanding, nodded and took their leave. Meanwhile, Martha remained on her porch, watching the exchange unfold with a mix of anger and confusion. She had expected the police to take action, to validate her concerns, but instead, they left without so much as a warning. She felt a new surge of resentment building inside her, one that wasn't going to fade easily. In her mind, she was still right, still justified. And that sense of vindication, mixed with growing isolation, deepened the divide between her and the Washingtons, a divide that now felt impossible to bridge. David approached the officers calmly, his composure unshaken by the tension of the situation. Perez and Thompson shifted uneasily, aware of the delicate balance they had to maintain. They respected David as their chief, but they were also here because of a complaint. David understood their position and kept his tone measured. "There's no issue here," he stated plainly, his voice carrying the authority that came naturally to him. The officers nodded but hesitated, caught between protocol and respect for their superior. David saw their uncertainty and offered a solution. "I'll speak to her directly," he said, motioning toward Martha's house. Perez and Thompson exchanged a glance before stepping back, grateful for the reprieve. David's leadership was evident. He was willing to address the conflict head-on, knowing that resolving it required a personal approach. David walked across the street, each step bringing him closer to the woman who had triggered the entire event. Martha stood on her porch, arms crossed defensively. Her eyes, narrowed in suspicion, tracked his every move. She still didn't fully grasp who David was or why he was handling things so calmly. To her, he was just a man from the barbecue that she had felt the need to report. As David reached her front steps, he greeted her politely, without a hint of the frustration he must have felt. "Ma'am," he began, "I wanted to come over and speak with you directly. There's no disturbance at the barbecue, just neighbors enjoying a meal together." Martha's posture stiffened. She wasn't prepared for such a direct confrontation, and her mind raced to justify her actions. "It was too loud," she muttered. "And, well, it just didn't seem right." David listened carefully, giving her the space to speak. He remained calm as she struggled to articulate why the gathering had bothered her so much. Her reasoning faltered as David's measured tone never wavered. "I understand you might not be used to this kind of event," he said, "but I can assure you, nothing inappropriate is happening. It's just a barbecue." Martha fumbled, trying to hold on to her indignation. "It just felt out of place. I didn't know who was coming and going. It seemed off." David's gaze remained steady. He knew what she wasn't saying, the part she was trying to avoid acknowledging. He let a moment of silence hang between them before speaking again, his voice even. "I think what's really bothering you isn't the barbecue itself, but who's attending it." Martha's eyes flashed with surprise. Her defenses flared as she tried to find a retort. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, her voice shaky. David didn't press too hard, but his next words landed firmly. "I'm the police chief, ma'am. The officers who arrived are under my command. There's no disturbance because I know exactly what's happening at that barbecue. My family is hosting it." Martha froze, the reality of the situation sinking in. Her mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came out. The assumptions she had built her complaint on crumbled in an instant. She had thought she was restoring order, but now she realized she had been acting on nothing more than her own prejudice. Her face paled, and for a brief moment she was at a loss. David, seeing the weight of her realization begin to settle, softened his tone. "We're just your neighbors, trying to share a meal with friends. There's nothing more to it." Martha's defenses cracked under the weight of his calm, clear words. The embarrassment washed over her, but she couldn't bring herself to fully acknowledge what had driven her actions. She stood there, conflicted, her mind grasping at remnants of her earlier certainty, but they slipped away. David, ever gracious, extended an olive branch. "Would you like a plate of food? There's plenty left." His offer was simple, genuine, but Martha couldn't accept it. She shook her head, her face red with a mix of shame and confusion. "No, thank you," she muttered, her voice small. She turned and walked back inside her house, retreating from the confrontation she had been so sure of moments ago. Back by their patrol car, Officers Perez and Thompson watched the interaction from a distance. They had never seen their chief handle something so delicate before, and it left an impression on both of them. As they drove away, Perez broke the silence. "That could have gone a lot worse." Thompson nodded in agreement. "He handled it perfectly. It must have been tough, though, having to deal with that right here, in his own neighborhood." Perez glanced in the rearview mirror at the Washington's barbecue, still going strong despite the interruption. "It's got to be frustrating, knowing people see you that way, even when you're just trying to live your life." Thompson sighed. "Yeah, but he didn't let it show. That's what makes him a good leader. He didn't let her ignorance get to him." As the officers reflected on the situation, the neighborhood itself seemed to hold its breath. Some of the neighbors who had witnessed the event felt a pang of shame, knowing that Martha had acted on prejudice rather than reason. Others, however, sympathized with her discomfort, unwilling to confront the deeper issues that had surfaced. It was a quiet, simmering divide, one that couldn't be addressed in a single conversation, but the seeds had been planted. David returned to the barbecue, his family and friends unaware of the full extent of what had just transpired. He carried the weight of the encounter with him, but he didn't let it dampen the spirit of the day. Instead, he focused on what mattered most: his family, his community, and the values he knew were worth standing up for, even when it wasn't easy. The morning after the barbecue, the neighborhood was silent. Martha sat by her window, still reeling from the confrontation with David. A mix of shame and confusion washed over her as she replayed the events in her mind. She had always prided herself on maintaining order, but yesterday had left her feeling exposed, her prejudices laid bare. The Washington family, however, appeared unaffected by the tension. Martha watched them from her window as David and Lena moved about their yard with the same warmth and optimism they had displayed from the moment they moved in. As she observed them, something tugged at her thoughts. They weren't angry. They weren't resentful. They simply continued living their lives, focused on their family, their home, and their future. Martha, on the other hand, felt stuck, trapped in a cycle of outdated thinking that she wasn't even sure she fully believed in anymore. It unsettled her, this quiet realization that maybe she had been wrong, not just about the Washingtons, but about how she saw the world around her. Yet, as much as she questioned her actions, she still clung to her old beliefs, unsure of how to let go of the past. Over the next few weeks, Martha kept to herself, avoiding direct contact with the Washingtons, but she couldn't help but notice small details. David's kindness, Lena's laugh, the way Marcus and Ava played without a care in the world. They were a family, just like any other, and gradually, Martha found her resentment softening. One afternoon, as the Washingtons passed her house, she did something she hadn't done before: she waved. It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. David noticed, giving her a nod of acknowledgement. Lena smiled warmly, and even Marcus and Ava waved back, unaware of the significance. The neighborhood, too, was shifting. Some neighbors, inspired by David's calm handling of the situation, had become more welcoming, engaging in brief but friendly conversations with the Washingtons when they passed. Others, however, remained distant, clinging to the comfort of familiarity. Change was slow, but it was happening. Martha, though still grappling with her internal struggles, was taking small steps forward, and the Washingtons noticed. They understood that transformation didn't happen overnight, but they recognized Martha's wave as a first step, a quiet signal that perhaps reconciliation was possible. As the weeks passed, the Washingtons decided to host another barbecue. They invited the neighborhood once again, hoping to foster more connections. This time, the invite was received with less hesitation from many, though some still declined. Martha, sitting on her porch as the sounds of the gathering drifted toward her, watched silently. She felt the familiar pull of resistance, but also a quiet curiosity. She had spent so much time distancing herself, but now there was a part of her that wondered if maybe it was time to take another step forward. For several long moments, Martha debated with herself, unsure of what to do. The idea of crossing the street, of joining the Washingtons at their barbecue, felt monumental. It wasn't just about attending a party. It was about acknowledging her own faults, about taking a step towards something different, something uncomfortable. But it was also about letting go of the weight she had been carrying for so long, the weight of prejudice, of isolation, of fear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Martha stood up. Her heart pounded as she crossed the street, her feet moving almost against her will. When she reached the edge of the Washingtons' yard, she hesitated again, but before she could turn back, David spotted her. His face broke into a welcoming smile. "Martha, glad you could make it," he said warmly. Lena followed suit, greeting her with a sincerity that made Martha's heart ache with a mix of relief and guilt. Martha stood awkwardly for a moment, unsure of how to respond. But there was no judgment in their eyes, no lingering resentment from what had happened before. They welcomed her as if she were any other neighbor, offering her a plate of food, a chair, a conversation. Slowly, Martha began to relax, though she remained quiet, content to observe rather than engage too deeply. She looked around at the gathering, the laughter, the mingling of people from different backgrounds, and felt something inside her shift. As the barbecue continued, the atmosphere felt lighter, as if the neighborhood itself was beginning to breathe easier. Some of the neighbors who had once shared Martha's discomfort now joined in more freely, chatting with the Washingtons, sharing stories, and breaking bread. Others still held back, but there was a sense that something fundamental was changing, that this was the beginning of a new chapter for the community. Martha sat quietly, watching it all unfold. She wasn't entirely sure where she fit in this new reality. She knew she still had a long way to go in confronting her own biases, but she also knew that by simply being here, she had taken an important step. The warmth of the Washingtons, their patience and kindness, had shown her that perhaps it wasn't too late to change, that maybe she could learn to be part of this evolving community. David, standing with Lena by the grill, glanced around at the gathering. He saw his children playing, his neighbors chatting, and even Martha sitting at the edge of the yard, lost in thought. A sense of quiet pride filled him. The road had been difficult, and it wasn't over, but this moment felt like a small victory. It was proof that change, though slow, was possible. David didn't need everyone to transform overnight, but seeing the steps people were taking, seeing Martha here, even after everything, was enough for now. As the day wound down, the camera pulled back, revealing the neighborhood as one living, breathing community. People of different races, backgrounds, and experiences mingled, sharing food, laughter, and stories. It wasn't perfect, and there were still divides, but there was also hope. Martha sat, reflecting on her place in all of this, still unsure of where she stood, but recognizing that change was inevitable, and perhaps not something to fear. David looked around one more time, a quiet smile on his face. This was his community, and though the challenges were far from over, he felt optimistic. He knew that small steps could lead to bigger ones, that leadership sometimes meant just being present, steady, and open. As the sun set on the barbecue, David felt a sense of peace. This was a beginning, a step toward a better future for everyone.